So first of all, thank you all for coming. And as I said, we're in for a real treat. Now, we're joined today by people who aren't members of the BAP. So I thought I'd just say a bit about what the BAP is for their interest. So the BAP is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Its first meeting was in April 1974. And it's always brought together a number of constituencies of people who are interested in neuroscience and mental health. So you have laboratory scientists, mental health professionals, industry, regulators, policymakers, and so on. They all come together to a forum to discuss things of mutual interest. And our first public lecture was in 2018 by Professor David Nutt on the drugs do work. 2019, Akim Su and Becky Inkster talked about hip-hop psychiatry, specifically the use of lyrics in hip-hop tracks to help understand the plight of people affected by mental health problems. Now in 2020 and 2021, there was a bit of a break for kind of obvious reasons. But in 22, we had a dual presentation from Nick Serow and Naomi Feinberg, which was focused on obsessive-compulsive disorder. And then last year, we had a dual presentation again from Lucy Rocker and Julia Sinclair, and that was focused on alcohol use disorders. But when we were thinking about the program for this celebratory anniversary meeting, we wanted to do something really special and to use it as an opportunity to reflect a little on the history of psychopharmacology, but really thinking about how things were before modern treatments became available. And we were absolutely delighted when Professor Femi Oyebode agreed to give our public lecture. Now, many of you will know Femi, but I am just going to run through some highlights from his CV. So Femi is an emeritus professor here at the University of Birmingham, where he was head of the Department of Psychiatry between 2003 and 2009. He worked clinically as a consultant psychiatrist at the National Centre for Mental Health at Birmingham and was director of the South Birmingham Mental Health Trust. Now, Femi is internationally recognised for his research in the areas of phenomenology and psychopathology, including the delusional misidentification syndromes. And he's the editor of that wonderful book, Symptoms in the Mind, which is now in its 6th edition. Femi was born in Lagos in Nigeria and studied medicine at the University of Ibadan, where he graduated in 1997. He moved to the UK and undertook psychiatry training in Newcastle, and some of his colleagues from that time are here today. He was awarded a Doctor of Medicine degree by Newcastle University in 1989, and then a PhD in the philosophy of mind by Swansea University in 1998. Now, I first met Femi in the examinations subcommittee at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and Femi was the chief examiner of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and he occupied that role from 2002. And he received the RC Psych Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016, and then the honorary FRC Psych, which actually is the highest award that the Royal College can give. He received that in 2019. Femi is interested in the intersection of psychiatry and literature, and he's an advocate for incorporating insights from the arts and humanities into postgraduate medical education. He's the author of Mind Readings, Literature and Psychiatry, published in 2009, and Madness at the Theatre, published in 2012. He's published multiple volumes of poetry, and wait for this, he was given legend recognition at the Creative Africans Award in 2017. Now, many of you will have heard his fantastically interesting and well-received podcast series on Radio 4, Is Psychiatry Working?, which was jointly presented with the writer Horatio Clare. That was a 6-episode series broadcast in 2023, and now we're well into a second series. So if you've not listened to them, there's an opportunity to do so on iPlayer. But today, Femi is going to focus on the work of a particular writer and a particular piece, and use that to make us think a little bit about life before modern psychopharmacology. So please join me in welcoming Femi Oyebode.
So thank you very much, David, for your wildly exaggerated welcome and introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm delighted to be here. And I ought to say thank you to Rachel Opdegrove, who put my name forward. And of course, she doesn't realize how anxious I get about these matters. She thinks that because I look relatively calm that it means that it's easy, but it isn't. And I'm particularly anxious today because I've looked at the program, and I think to myself, these are really clever people. And here I am, I'm just going to be talking about literature and talking about a story rather than talking about proper science. But nonetheless, I hope that when you've heard what I've got to say, that you think that some of it is relevant to your purposes and aims. So I'm going to be talking for about 40 minutes. I'll talk about Anton Chekhov, and I'm focusing on it's a novella, his novella, Ward Number 6. And the way I want to approach it is I'll tell you a little bit, not very much, just to tell you a little bit about Anton Chekhov. And if I might, I'll say something about his poetics. So I use the word poetics to say something about his approach to literature. And then I'll take you through, not in a kind of literary, scholarly sort of way, but I'll take you through this novella, Word Number 6, and with a view to using it to remind ourselves how extraordinary it is, what the incredible achievements of psychopharmacologists have been to psychiatry. It's just extraordinary. And no apologies for doing it that way. In any case, from your purposes, it's a 50 years of a celebratory kind of conference. But no apologies for taking that approach, because of course, as you know, there are even colleagues of ours who are psychiatrists and have no idea why they're psychiatrists, who think these disorders don't exist and who think these drugs don't work. And they need reminding about how awful things were before 1952. And the very young psychiatrists who have never seen what an asylum is like may start to believe that these disorders, these conditions have been invented by psychiatrists for no good purpose. So if I need any kind of excuse for doing it, that's one of the main reasons why I'm taking this approach. So to come back to Anton Chekhov, he's born in Russia, in Taganrog, in 1860, and to a family, his father was a shopkeeper, and he's a grandson of serfs. And it's important just to remind us of what a serf is in the Russian environment. So the serf is the equivalent of being a slave in the USA. So it's a total degree of serfdom. It is slavery as we know it by a different name. So for him to have reached the pinnacle of his achievement, so you recognize, you understand how clever and how ambitious and how successful he was. And there's the other thing about Anton Chekhov's childhood that is worth mentioning, the idea that the family fell into debt, and his father was going to be taken to a debtor's prison, and the family had to flee from Taganrog to Moscow. And that always reminds me of the fact that Cervantes, who you should all know, who wrote Don Quixote de la Mancha, he also came from a family where the father spent some time in a debtor's prison, and the same is true for our own Dickens. So there's a kind of pondering there about why is it that great writing comes out of such incredible kind of privation. But that's a discussion for another day. So that's his background. And he went to Moscow, followed the rest of the family to Moscow, and got into the University of Moscow Medical School in 1879. And it was already clear by the second year that he had TB. So that itself is absolutely incredible because like a lot of writers from the 19th century, there's a lot of letters between him and his sister and him and his brother. So we know quite a lot about his life. We know quite a lot about his approach to literature, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I just wanted to say a little bit about this idea of a doctor who has an illness. So when you read these letters, he should have known that he had TB. So he got these letters where he's going to Sakhalin, so he's going 3,000 miles from Moscow, and he has these letters to his sister saying, "I've been coughing," and there's a bit of blood in the cough, and I think it's just a catarrh. You know, and he says this repeatedly. So there's kind of this denial that doctors have when they've got serious illness and they can't admit that they've got serious illness. So it took a long time before not that there was any treatment in any case, but it took a long time for him to admit that he had TB. So he studied medicine and then practiced medicine all his life, and not just practiced medicine all his life. He practiced free of charge to poor people. He never stopped, even though we know him. Most people don't even know he was a doctor, a practicing doctor. We know him as a writer, and most people in this room probably know him as a playwright. So you would know Uncle Vanya, and you would know The Cherry Orchard, the plays. But personally, I think he's a far better short story writer than he is a playwright. And he was writing at the same time as Ibsen, and Henrik Ibsen. And in comparison to Ibsen, they claim not to know one another, but I'm very surprised if they didn't. So if you read letters by Ibsen, he doesn't say, I think somebody asked him towards the end of his life whether he'd heard of this Russian playwright, and he claimed that he didn't know who he was. But Ibsen's a far, far, far better writer, and he is a better playwright, and incredible contribution to the way in which the theater works. Extraordinary achievements, things that you would now not even know were invented. He invented them. So he invented, I know I'm not supposed to be talking about Ibsen, but I cannot, I can't be doing this without saying a little bit about Ibsen. So Ibsen is extraordinary. So Ibsen, before Ibsen, the great figure of Shakespeare towered over the theater. And Ibsen was a person who rescued the theater from palaces and from kings and princes. He democratized the theater so that when you enter the theater, the room when you look on the stage, the room is set up like your home was. And his instructions, his direction was absolutely specific. He told you what cravat to wear, he told you what the actors, he told them what suits to wear, so that they would reflect the people who were in the audience, so that the audience wouldn't think that these events happened to Henry VIII or Henry V or anything of that sort. They knew that these were people like themselves, so social realism. And even more surprising, because when I tell you this, you wouldn't believe it, is that before Ibsen, the actors declaimed to the public, they declaimed to the audience. And it was Ibsen who changed acting completely so that they talked to one another like that. And he forced the actors to listen to one another so that the feeling that comes out of the acting is a feeling which is in response to what you're hearing. And it took quite a while for the actors to be able to adapt, because all the great actors had learned how to do soliloquies, speaking to the audience, whereas contemporary great acting is talking to one another, just like we would in real life. Anyway, that's a side kind of little show, just to remind ourselves that they were contemporaries, but in my view, Ibsen is just extraordinary. But Chekhov is a master storyteller, and a bit like Dickens, he wrote for money. And you must not underestimate the value of writing for money. So he had to produce this material for a copy, because it had to be in the newspapers or in the journals by Saturday. And he wrote these short stories, lots of them. They're absolutely marvelous. So he had a few things to say about his poetics, his attitude, his approach to literature. And I just to tickle your fancy a little bit, I thought I'd read out a little bit of an excerpt of a letter to Alexei Suvorin. And Alexei Suvorin was his publisher, but they were very close friends, and they had a lot of exchange of letters. These letters themselves are worth reading, quite aside from reading his short stories. And Alexei wrote a letter to him to ask him, to say why is he still practicing medicine? He might as well focus properly on literature and the theater, because of course he was quite good at it. And he wrote this wonderful little piece to him. He said, you advise me not to hunt after two hares and not to think of medical work. I do not know why one should not hunt two hares, even in the literal sense. I feel more confident and more satisfied with myself when I reflect that I have two professions and not one. Medicine is my lawful wedded wife, and literature is my mistress. When I get tired of one, I spend the night with the other. It's beautiful, absolutely wonderful, wonderful, isn't it? I love it. And so that's just to remind us how he practiced all the time. And he also said that I have no doubt that the study of medicine has had an important influence on my literary work. It has considerably enlarged the sphere of my observation, has enriched me with knowledge that the true value of which for me as a writer can only be understood by one who is himself a doctor. So that's, again, reminding us of the fact that medicine was absolutely central to his literature. And the short stories and the two novellas, there's the Black Monk, which is a person who has bipolar disorder, absolutely clear bipolar disorder, which I'm not talking about today. And then, of course, we've got Ward Number 6. And there's several other short stories that are all, they're not set in hospitals necessarily, but some of the characters will be doctors, and some of the characters might have illnesses, and a lot of the characters who have illnesses have psychiatric disorders. And the point that he's making about this idea that medicine is central is that it's not that he's fastidiously accurate in his description of illness, but he is, but it's for art. So it's not boring, it's not a lecture, but he's not a person who writes about illnesses in a loose sort of way as a symbol of what somebody who has a degenerative condition might be like, or something like that. So they are characters who have illnesses, but the illnesses are not mere symbols of degradation or anything of that sort. They are actual lived experience of people who are ill. And he writes from that point of view. So psychiatrists should be reading him because he writes a lot about psychiatry. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about Ward Number 6. And I need you to know that there are different ways in which you can approach Ward Number 6. And the easiest and most straightforward way of approaching it is to say that it's just a story. It is just a story set in an asylum. And it just shows us what asylums were like in Russia in the late 1800s. And you can just leave it at that. But I need to just tell you that the reputation of Ward Number 6 in Russia is that it was what Lenin read that told him that they had to have the 1918 revolution. So you can read it as an allegory that the asylum is Russia itself. And the attempt of the psychiatrists to reform the asylum is speaking to the idea of the guys who wanted to reform Russia. And I'm not giving anything away when I tell you that the doctors, the psychiatrists' attempt to reform the hospital failed. And that's important from Lenin's point of view, this idea that to reform Russia was going to fail. Therefore, he had to be very, very courageous to actually approach it. So essentially, it's a way of saying there are two ways to read word number 6. And we can read it as we're doing today, as psychiatrists read it about the nature of hospitals, of asylums, and so on. And so I'll just read little excerpts of it to you to give you a sense of what it's like. And like a lot of psychiatric hospitals, even now, they're not part of the general hospital. So ward number 6 is set apart from the rest of the hospitals, which is just remind us of what our situation, even in today's world, in the UK, is like. So he says that ward number 6 is a small outbuilding surrounded by dense jungle of burdock, nettles, and wild hemp. The roof is rusty. Half of the chimney has collapsed. The steps to the door are rotten and overgrown with grass. Only the traces of plaster remain. Next, you enter a large and spacious room which occupies the rest of the building, apart from the lobby. Here the walls are painted dirty blue. The ceiling is black with soot, as in a chimneyless peasant hut. Obviously, the stove smokes in winter and fills the space with fumes. On the inside, the windows are disfigured with bars. And so it's very accurate, beautiful description. You can picture it. Of course, the greatest writing, as I say, is that you show, you don't tell, so you can visualize this description, which is a sign of the actual character, the actual acumen, the actual ability of the writer when he can evoke something that you can see. I mean, that is a sign of great writing. And I'm reminded myself, I used to be on the Mental Health Commission. I joined the Mental Health Commission all those years ago in 1989, and I served on it until 1992. And I chaired the actual visit to Rain Hill in Liverpool that led to Rain Hill being closed. And whatever his name was, the chairman of the regional office came to this meeting where I was a person who gave the feedback to them that they had to close it, which he was very upset because he took a look at me and thought, what's this African telling me that some place isn't good enough? Have they got hospitals like this in his own country? So he looked at me and I looked back at him to say, this is terrible. You've got to close it. That's just all there is to say about it. And Rain Hill was horrendous, no different from what I've just described. And that was 1992. So it's not that long ago. That they had cockroaches on the wall. The paints were falling off. The remnant of the patients, they closed practically everywhere else. But the last 100 to 150 people, they came down. They had their bedrooms upstairs. And at the end in the morning, when they came down, they weren't allowed to go back upstairs. So they had to be downstairs all day until it was bedtime. And every single one of them was still dressed in the same clothing. And there were no names on this clothing. It was dished out to people, irrespective of their sizes. I mean, that's just and that's 1992. So we're reading something which is set in the 1800s, but I'm telling you something which occurred in this country right up till the 90s. So it gives a sense of what our subject, what our discipline has had to work with. Now, of course, there's always a nurse, and we don't want to blame nurses or anything of that sort, but this is a novel, and it's trying to capture the idea of 1800s psychiatry in Russia. And Nikita is our nurse, and he's called in the novella, he's called the ward attendant. And on top of all this rubbish, his pipe perpetually clenched between his teeth, lies Nikita, the warder, an old soldier with faded reddish-brown chevrons. He has a red nose, a grim, haggard face, and beetling eyebrows that give him the expression of a steep sheepdog. Although short, thin, and wiry, he has an intimidating air and powerful face. He is one of those simple, efficient, thoroughly dependable, thick-headed men who worship discipline above all else in the world, and who are therefore convinced that patients are there to be beaten. He showers blows on face, chest, back, on whatever comes first. in the firm belief that this is the only way to maintain discipline. So you get a beautiful, great description. Of course, there were no drugs. But just to remind us, just before we start to think, oh my God, this is Russia, of course, pretty barbaric Russians, just to remind us that what's going on here. So I thought I might as well let you see what our own, what John Percival has to say. So John Percival was in hospital 1830 to 1832. He wrote his memoirs in 1840. And I'll just give you a little excerpt of what he has to say, just to remind us that it's not just fiction, that you've got Chekhov describing it so realistically, but you could think it's just a novel. And Percival says, I was taken to bed in the innermost cell, the fourth in the row. There was a mattress of straw and a pillow of straw, both stinking of the cowyard on which I was laid. I was then strapped down with a broad strap over my chest, and my right hand was manacled to a chain in the wall. No explanation of any kind was made to me, and I was left alone to my own meditation. So it gives you an idea what it was like. So I do that in order to just convince you that it's not all fiction, because you can think that Chekhov is just writing a novel. And so that's John Percival. And John Percival, he was in a private asylum. He was the third of 7 children of Spencer Percival. His father was the only British Prime Minister ever to be assassinated. So he wasn't working class, is the point I'm trying to make. He wasn't poor. He wasn't in a county asylum. He had paid to be there. You get the sense of what it was like. He was paid to be there. Or they were paid. Dr. Fox was paid. He paid Dr. Fox to be there. So they weren't, it wasn't charity, is the point I'm trying to make. And he goes on to say that, and this comes straight back to our conference about treatments. He says, I do not recollect at any time medicine being given me, neither to purify the blood, neither as tonics, except on 2 occasions. No, the cheap and universal nostrum was to be ducked in the cold bath, in the depth of winter or not, no matter what my previous habits. All right, so no treatments. And Nikita is not just a novelistic character. The barbarity, the barbarous treatments of people was going on across the whole world, because that's just how people were treated, probably because there were no treatments available. There were no proper treatments that would assist them. So that's it. And Gromov is the central character who is the patient. And he'd been a civil servant. And I don't think it's accidental that Chekhov has taken a civil servant as a kind of central character who is mentally ill. Anyway, so he's chosen Gromov. And Gromov has a lot of interesting things to say that our patients say today. So Gromov says, but madness is apparent in other things besides so this is of course Chekhov talking about Gromov, but madness is apparent in other things besides his grimaces and persistent nervous tension. Some evenings he wraps himself tightly in his smock and dashes from corner to corner, and in between the beds, trembling all over, his teeth shattering as if he has a high fever. So we know he's not right. But the discussion, one of the problems that the psychiatrist, who I'm going to come to in a minute, has, is that he has these discussions. He enjoys talking to Gromov. Even though Gromov is ill, his brain still works. He's a reasonable person. Actually, he's quite a highly intelligent person. And Gromov says to him, yes, I'm ill, but tens, hundreds of madmen roam around at will because you, in your ignorance, cannot distinguish them from the sane. Why do I and all these other poor devils have to be cooped up here like scapegoats? You, your assistant, the superintendent, and all you hospital scum are, as far as morals go, infinitely lower than each one of us. So why are we cooped up and you aren't? Where is the logic? And that goes to the heart of if you go back and you have a look at the Roman comedies, some of the Roman comedies, the center of them is the idea that psychiatrists or doctors can't distinguish between the person who is ill and the person who isn't. So this idea of the difficulty in distinguishing between illness and normality goes back 2,000 years, at least as we know in terms of the things we can read and talk about. So that is in there, this great difficulty, which hasn't left us, the idea of what are the demarcations between the norm and the abnormal, and what are the ways in which we can be absolutely certain that the judgments we make are correct, and so on. And our psychiatrist, Dr. Ragin, and he's an interesting man, so he's a typical psychiatrist, very thoughtful, a little bit introspective, and thinks about the world and always trying to improve things, and a little bit lacking in confidence because, of course, compared to the surgeons, what can he achieve? So you got that kind of a little bit of kind of insecurity given the nature of our profession. Even then, you've got that, and you've got that in there because Chekhov himself, he probably knows a few psychiatrists, so he can describe them properly. And Ragin says, this is that kind of wonderful, the tone that I try to get into the BBC, psychiatry working. And so I have in my ear, I've got this kind of idea that Chekhov has. So Ragin says, compared with the past, psychiatry, with its current classification of diseases, its diagnostic procedures and methods of treatment, had taken an enormous leap forward. No longer are the insane doused with cold water, nor are they put in straitjackets. They are treated as human beings, and according to newspaper reports, they even have their own dramatic entertainments and dances. Ragin knows very well that with modern views and tastes as they are, such abominations as Ward Number 6 are possible only in a small town, 125 miles from the nearest railway, where the mayor and councillors are semi-literate barbarians who look upon doctors as high priests who must be trusted blindly, even if they pour molten lead down patients' throats. So you've got that sort of incredible kind of sense that us psychiatrists have. If only we had more money. I've just been saying that earlier today, that if only we had more money, things would be so much better. If only we had more beds. And if only these psychopharmacologists would just give us drugs that didn't have side effects. So you've got that sort of tone of this kind of the kind of promissory note, kind of promissory idea that things are likely to get better very soon. And as I've said, even I have that sort of tone. I borrowed it from Chekhov on the BBC program, and I say, have a look at ketamine. Only have to give it once, and the person gets better in 24 hours. That sort of, hoping that so we are not going to be in this parlor state that we've been for quite a long time. But the downfall for Ragin is that he starts to spend more time with the patients than he does with his employers, the council and the councillors and the mayor. And they can't understand why he's spending more time with the patients and why he actually goes to the hospital to go and talk to these patients and to talk to Gromov. And they contrive, because it is just too far gone. They cannot stand the idea of it. So they contrive to have him essentially to have him sectioned as being mentally ill because he spends time with mentally ill people. And he says, this is Ragin, it's all a nasty trick. All that's wrong with me is that in 20 years, I've managed to find only one intelligent man in the whole town, and he's a lunatic. I'm not ill at all. I'm simply being caught in a vicious circle from which there's no escape. But it doesn't matter. I'm ready for anything. So it's a tragedy, really, because he's admitted, and then Nikita, whose only treatment is to beat people up, beats him up and he dies in the same hospital where he's been working. So it's a very sad, tragic story. And as I said, there's an aspect of it which you could say makes you feel kind of despondent because it looks as if reforms don't work. So there's that aspect of it that we've got to be aware of. But of course, you could say that is that degree of hopelessness and despair at the end of the novella was what made Lenin act with aggression, because he thought they had to do something to overturn the kind of chaos and the kind of ways in which ordinary people were oppressed in imperial Russia. And I thought to finally try to draw to a close, I thought to just to remind myself, of course, that our new era all happened in 1952, and just to remind ourselves that these drugs, of course, they were recognized very quickly and easily for what they were, and you didn't. I mean, I know that that the first proper trials were done here in Birmingham, but I don't want necessarily to refer to that. But just to say that you didn't have to do a double-blind control trial to know that the drugs worked. I mean, that's just the truth of it, really. And there are wonderful anecdotes of the gardeners at St. Anne's in Paris, of the gardeners turning up at work one day, and there was silence on the wards, and the gardeners turning to one another to say, "Have they all left?" Only to discover that it was because they'd been administered chlorpromazine, and a lot of people had got better, and they were no longer shouting and jumping and breaking doors and windows and so on. So you didn't have to do drug trials to know that these drugs worked. And it's a mystery to me that there are people who, in today's world, actually have a doubt as to whether these drugs work or not. And as a senior house officer in Nigeria, and I worked with an outstanding psychiatrist, Tolani Asoni, who's passed away now. And we didn't have the encumbrances of the British system, so we didn't have to go to get a magistrate in order to go onto the streets to collect people and bring them in, because we saw they were vagrant psychotics. And we gave them Modicate. And these people, they'd been missing from their families for decades. And they woke up and they talked to us. And they told us where their families were. And we were able to repatriate them to their families, and we were able to meet their families. So we didn't have to do drug trials to know that Modicate worked. That's the point I'm trying to make. So in summary, what I hope I've done is hope I've whetted your interest in reading Anton Chekhov. Definitely, I hope that you go and read a bit more of Chekhov. He's wonderful. They're not all medical stories. It's amazing stories about love, and as you would expect, and so on. And I hope I've whetted your appetite to read more of Chekhov, but more importantly, to show how literature, because of its capacity to inspire empathy, to make you see things properly because of the gift of the writer, and because the gift of the writer makes you remember it if they're properly gifted, so that you couldn't. I don't think you could forget word number 6 after today if you've never read it before, because the writing brings it to light and brings it to mind in so vividly. But at the end of it all, it sheds light on our subject, reminds us of where we've come from, reminds us how terrible things were. And we're not saying they're perfect now, but they're certainly, in comparison to where they were, they're much, much better, no doubt. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Femi. That was magnificent. And Femi is very happy to receive comments or questions now, maybe for sort of 15 to 20 minutes. And so if you do would like to raise a question or make a comment, do please wait for the microphone. Femi said that he loves the interplay, the bavardage in questions and answers. So please, who would like to go first? I can see John Cookson first, so let's go for him, and then the lady in front. So John.
Femi, thank you very much. It made me think of Solzhenitsyn and Cancer Ward, which was also a sort of treatise on the Soviet era. Do you see a similarity there?
You're right. I mean, so the story is told about Stalin, that if he wants to send you to the Gulag, and of course he sent Solzhenitsyn to the Gulag, that he wants to send you to the Gulag. The only question that he asks, first of all, is he one of the greats? And I think of that in two ways. One of them is to say, the kind of barbaric approaches to life that Stalin had, that nonetheless he still respected literature. So that if his assistants told him that the person he wanted to send to Siberia was one of the greats, then he became a little bit less willing to send them. But he still sent Solzhenitsyn, which probably says something about the fact that they didn't realize how great he was at the time. But yes, you're right that Solzhenitsyn is in the tradition of obviously of great Soviet writing, and I agree that Cancer Ward and the others, One Day in the Life of Ivan, whatever it is, they are obviously worthy of reading from our point of view.
Thank you. Excuse me, the microphone, if you could come down to the front here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a pharmacist. I just graduated from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and so depression is a topic that's spoken a lot about, but while you're speaking and explaining and describing the novella of Chekhov, I cannot help but think of the movie and the book, The One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
I cannot help but think of that scene when one of the psychotic patients was in love with one of the females that visited there, and how he was mistreated just for being a psychotic patient. In your opinion, since I love that you mix the literature to the health centers for psychology or psychotic patients, in your opinion, what is the first step or the best way to improve such departments in order for the patient to be treated as a human being and a patient and not some crazy person?
Yes, I mean, you're right to talk about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because it's been so influential, but for the wrong reasons. So very, very influential for people who hold anti-psychiatry views because, of course, they see mistreatment and they see ECT being given without anesthetics, and they see the oppression. But I wouldn't argue. I don't have if you were to ask me what my principal view on literature, including film, is about portrayal of life, I don't, because I just think literature and cinema and the theater, you can't censor them. So I don't have a view that you shouldn't do it this way or you shouldn't do it that way or anything of that sort. So that's important to say that. But to come back to because I think your real question for me is something to do with the nature of empathy and how the media, how literature can assist in facilitating empathic connection with people who have psychiatric conditions. I think that's your real question. And I suppose that if I didn't believe that literature has this capacity, I wouldn't go around teaching people using literature to talk about what human experiences are like. Because I think one of the things that literature does, when it's the literature of the best kind of literature, one of the things it does, it allows you to enter into the life of another person, into how somebody else feels, properly speaking. And once you've done that, I think it's just harder to mistreat the person. But of course, there are people who say that literature is not for that purpose. They think literature is art for art's sake. I don't subscribe to that so very much. I still think that great writing allows you to enter into someone else's world that you may not be able. So, for example, if you're reading Chinua Achebe, who's a Nigerian writer, you're reading what he has to say about what life was like in eastern Nigeria in the 19th century. Absolutely wonderful, because and if you're never going to go to Nigeria, never going to go to Africa, you can see what life was like at a very pivotal period in African history, where the Africans were coming into contact with Europeans, and the influence of European perspective on African culture. So reading Achebe does wonders for you. But just in the same way that we've been talking this afternoon about Chekhov and how Chekhov helps us to see what's going on in an asylum. And once you see what's going on in the asylum and you see how Nikita treats the people, then you can't not see that if you were to go into the wards. So I'm not suggesting that bad treatment doesn't take place now, but what Chekhov does is it helps you to see it, because once you've read it properly, then when you see it, even in its how shall we say, in its ameliorated form, you will still see it for what it is.
Thank you. We have 1, 2, 3 questions on this side, so I'll go from Akeem first, and then up to Alan with the guy in the middle, and then we'll do the questions on this side. So Akeem first.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture, Professor Oyebode. I wanted to talk about a philosophical concept called control of knowledge, the concept about how there's a hierarchy of knowledge where Western concepts of literature are placed above certain things and how that needs to be democratized. So I wanted to talk about hip-hop. I did the lecture on hip-hop and mental health, and I would say you have profound storytelling, very vivid, by people like Tupac. So he has a song called Shed So Many Tears, where he says, back in elementary, I thrived on misery, left me alone, I grew up amongst a dying breed. It looks like my mind couldn't find a place to rest until I had that thug life tattooed on my chest. And thug life is an acronym for the hate you give little infants, F's everything. And it's a concept about how early childhood experiences can lead to further mental health problems, but very, very profound, just as profound as anything Chekhov said. So I just wanted to comment that we have this great urban art by people like Nas, by Tupac, by Kendrick Lamar, and I just wanted you to comment on modern art forms which aren't within those conventional literature forms that would be respected. Thank you.
Thank you. Whilst you're thinking, if the microphone could be moved back to the guy in the waistcoat there, with his hand raised. So,
so I totally agree with you. I agree about the kind of hierarchy of knowledge. I agree about that. One of our colleagues was in public health, is Nigerian. Sheye Abimbola has been doing a lot of work published in the Lancet. You might want to look at that. So it talks about who has the right and the power to add to knowledge, and whose information is regarded highly, and so on. So I agree that there's a hierarchy of that sort. And I also agree that we're not going to get very far if we don't tackle that. And so I agree that it may sound as if I've been talking about high art this evening, but I'm certainly not thinking that there are no other ways in which art can be done. And I don't think that, so I sometimes say to people, I read complete rubbish, to me. I just read total rubbish, sort of, I read thrillers, I read crime, I watch rubbish TV, just totally, you wouldn't want to know what I watch, really. So I think that the content of material can be present anywhere where you're looking for them. So that's really important just to say that, to confirm, to agree with you that you are right, really.
Okay, thank you. Go on the waistcoat.
Thank you for your stimulating talk. I was just wondering, back to Chekhov, when did you think the doctor and indeed the philosophical writer from Black Monk became unwell? Because at the beginning of the novella, the doctor is a person who clearly feels very deeply. He wants to help the hospital, he wants to make improvements, he can't, he falls into a stage of apathy where he just lives a mundane existence. And in the Black Monk, the writer creates his best work whilst he's unwell, and when he's treated with bromide and milk, he just seems to gain weight and sleep for many, many hours.
Yes.
Is it?
Yeah,
Is
okay.
Thank you very much. I just say very briefly that because I've been talking about word number 6, so if I just use the opportunity to talk about the Black Monk, that it's a novella, so it's not real life. It has to, like all great literature, it has to be close enough to real life for it to persuade the reader to read it. But it has to be different enough that it's a story. So, and sometimes people talk about the fact that that literature is all to do with how you manage time. So you're just like in the cinema, that you contract things that would take 20 years to happen. You contract it into just 2 or 3 minutes because you have to manage time to make the thing work. So psychiatrists should read The Black Monk because it has in it all the things that we know that can happen in bipolar disorder. It has in it incredible energy, extraordinary vivacity that the person has, and how, as you say, when the person is most ill, that's when he has the most ideas that relate to his profession, his scholarly works. So that's true, and if a person who has bipolar disorder reads that, they can see themselves in it because they know that there are periods when, even though they're ill, actually there's a lot of thinking that is taking place. But that's mania, hypomania probably, because it loses control at some point. So it's worth reading, really. That's all I want to say about it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Now, before Alan asks his question, if you could come down with the microphone down to the front here, right at the front. Okay, so Alan, please ask your question.
Thanks very much, Femi, as ever, for a wonderful, erudite lecture, and it's particularly nice to see you in Birmingham. About 40 years ago, Professor Ken Rawnsley, when he was president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, wrote a marvellous defence of psychiatry, talking about the ambivalent attitude with which it's regarded by the public and how that's probably related to the ambivalent attitude towards mental illness. But of course that was the early 1980s, and he talks about the abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet system. And of course, as you well recall, but some others may not know, psychiatry was particularly abused, and people were called psychotic if they were dissident but against the system, but not clearly psychotic, or indeed not ill at all. And Rawnsley talks about an underground handbook that the dissidents had, which described how to manage that situation. And part of this was a typology of psychiatrists divided into different types, including, I'm afraid to say, academic psychiatrists and managers and so on and so forth, and how best to approach these people when they were abusing the system and keeping you in psychiatric hospital, essentially illegitimately. So my question is, does that typology exist in literature? Because you talk about the psychiatrists here as if it's just one, archetype, but clearly there's different ones. But thank you very much again.
Thank you. I'm not sure that you might think I would have, but I don't think I've done a study of psychiatrists in literature. Maybe I should have, but I haven't done that study. But so if you look at Bell Jar, if you look at Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar, there are 2 psychiatrists in there, and it shows you something about the ways in which psychiatrists work and what sort of psychiatrist works for patients in terms of their ability to be open, to be flexible, and to be honest and truthful, and to know how to say, so that I can't recall properly, but there's an engagement over whether or not she should have ECT. And of course, Bell Jar is very autobiographical. And the ways in which the person says it, even though she would agree to have it, but the way in which the person says it has an effect upon the character. So there's a long-winded way of saying there are different kinds of psychiatrists who exist in great literature, not in literature which is there to use psychiatry as like a tabloid, So if you're talking about proper literature, which is properly studied and the person knows what they're doing, So that's, and her name escapes me now, the New Zealand writer, Frame, and Janet Frame. And Janet Frame, she wrote her autobiography, and she met lots and lots of psychiatrists, and she was treated for schizophrenia in New Zealand, in Auckland. And then she came to the Maudsley and saw, again, his name escapes me, he used to be chief examiner at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, but worked at the Maudsley. And she talked about why she took to him, even though she'd met lots of psychiatrists, and she took to him because I think it's so corny to say listening matters. Do you know what I mean? It sounds, why are you in psychiatry if you're not going to listen? I don't understand that at all. I mean, what are you doing in it? So she talks about great valuing the fact that this person actually listened. So that made a lot of difference to her. But he looked after her for quite a period of time. And one of the other things she said about him was that she realized that over the course of time that she saw him, he developed as an individual himself. And which brings me to this business, which I sometimes talk to trainees about, which is that the psychiatrists, the doctors in general, make the big error of thinking that they are doing the assessing. They forget that they are being assessed. Do you know what I mean? So they think it's a one-way traffic. It's not a one-way traffic. It's two-way. You are doing assessments, and they are assessing you back in return. And they're making judgments, not just that they're assessing you, they're making judgments. And they're making judgments that really count about what sort of human being you are. So people need to remember that. So I think that goes to your question, which is to do what are the typologies. And so typologies exist, no doubt at all.
I think we have time for just a few questions. So we'll take the gentleman at the front.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So the psychiatrist in the story kind of throws medication and smashes it and loves talking philosophy with patients. Obviously, this was before we had effective treatments.
Yes.
How much of the time do you think good psychopharmacologists should be spending talking philosophy with their patients, or even engaging in psychological treatments as well as prescribing these medications?
Thank you. We could move the microphone back to the lady in the blue dress, and then we'll take that one there at the end. Okay,
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that it's going to be like an aside joke, but it's still speaking to your question. So one of my teachers in Newcastle passed away recently, and his grandson wrote to me to say, would I be willing to do a little thing about him to send to the family? And I never met this grandson or anything like that, and I last worked with this senior person when I moved to Birmingham in 1986, and I agreed to do this. So I did 500 words. And the heart of that 500 words was the idea that you bring the totality of your person to the clinical encounter. You bring everything to the clinical encounter. Just like if you're an actor, you bring everything in there. So, and what I meant by bringing everything to the clinical encounter is that you bring charm, you bring wit, you bring coercion, you bring deceptiveness, you bring intimacy, you bring all the things that human beings are, for as long as it is for the patient's good. Because all of those things I've just mentioned, you could do it for narcissistic reasons. So it's an answer to your question, which is to say, whether you're a psychiatrist who has an interest in psychopharmacology or not, you ought to be interested in human life. You ought to be able to hear what it is that the person is saying and be able to conceive it, not in psychoanalytic terms, but in psychotherapeutic terms. You have to be able to understand that. And if you're a psychiatrist, you ought to know about learning theory. You should be able to conceive of some of the things that people are saying to you as if it was Pavlov. So what I'm trying to say is that you are not there I hope anyway, that you're not there as a thin slice. You're there with the totality of your person, and you're using all the bits of you that matter for the purpose of the person in front of you. And that's how I see it. And the drugs is just a tiny little aspect of that. That's how I see it anyway.
Thank you. Femi, lady there in the blue dress. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lecture this evening. And what's really resonated is the benefit of reading works about mental health and illness and the state in which we treat people and historical aspects and all of this. But one thing that I'm left curious is your thoughts on the benefits to people themselves writing and creating art who are experiencing mental illness or psychosis. So in addition to consuming literature, would you say there's a benefit to making it as well, or other art?
Before you answer, if the microphone could be taken to this lady in the striped shirt, and I'll make that the last question, I think. Yeah. Okay, so, Femi.
Yes, so the answer, a straightforward answer to your question is yes. I personally, I read lots and lots of memoirs, lots of them. And I tend to do the book reviews for the British Journal of Psychiatry for memoirs. And my co-presenter on the BBC series, the psychiatry work, is Horatio Clare. And we came to meet over the fact that he'd written his memoirs of his mental illness, of his episode of mania. So it's absolutely true that the memoirs are very, very, very helpful indeed to all of us who work in this field. I just think you ought to be reading them because it gives you a special insight into how people are feeling and how they come to feel the way they do and so on. And the other question you asked, which I'm not sure the answer to, is whether it's useful to the person who's writing. And so on my best days, the answer to that question is I say yes. On my worst days, I say it may not be. Because if you take the great writers and you think of, I'm not going to argue that Virginia Woolf ended up where she was because she was a writer and that the writing had excoriated her skin in such a way that it worsened her condition. I don't want to argue that, but I want to say maybe it did contribute to it. And you want to look at Hemingway, and you think, how much of because when you're writing, you are, without question, going into the self. You're not doing scholarly work where you're essentially reading other people's works and quoting it. I just don't think that's got anything to do with looking into yourself. But when doing literature, you have to go into yourself. And there may be things that are better left alone. So sometimes I think authorial agency is wonderful because you can change the endings when you grasp your life and you're writing about your life. It can change how you see it. It can give you more confidence and authority and so on. And that can be said to be good. But I worry about sometimes whether it makes it worse because you're exploring it in a way where you don't have the support like you might do if you're in psychotherapy. So I think it depends as the answer.
Finally, yeah.
Thank you so much for a really brilliant talk. I just want to ask, I went to another talk recently by someone who, forgive me, whose name I forget, but she was talking, she's a genetics researcher at Cambridge, but she was talking about the use of theatre in co-production and the way that it can be used, particularly improvisational theatre, to kind of level the dynamics between researcher and sort of public engagement or public participation group. And her talk was really brilliant, but I think as an audience of geneticists and neuroscientists, we were all, oh no, theatre, because the way that we study science in the UK is very, I don't know how much it differs internationally, but it's very split from the humanities, and you do a BSc or you do a BA. And I think within science there's quite a lot of elitism about sort of humanities study and degrees, and about it being sort of more important, but it means that some really brilliant tools like using theatre in co-production, we've got no sort of possible skill to do. Do you think there's a sort of any realistic or practical ways we can alter the higher education system in the UK to make sure that this sort of study of humanities can be integrated into science?
Yes, so I was born in Lagos, and we inherited the British system. And you had to choose science or arts at the age of 13. And I did sciences. So you could say that I haven't written essays since I was 13. It's a great handicap, I would say. But there's a lot to be said for the French system. There's a lot to be said for encouraging people doing the sciences to continue to do the arts to quite a high level, and people doing the arts to understand the rigor, the absolute utmost rigor of the sciences. But obviously, we're not going to solve that problem in this room. But you put your finger on something which is very important. I think that one of the things my final comment, one of the things I learned, and it's an aside to your question, but it's still related. One of the things I learned over the last 3 years working with people who were not doctors and not scientists and not, who came from a humanities, history or English, and then went to journalism school, one of the things I learned is that we approach the world in very, very different ways. So take something so simple as a story. So the people who come from the humanities, they think of a story, since Freud, they think of a story as something to do with childhood experiences, that inflecting your adult behaviors, and trauma occurring and deflecting you from your utmost goal. That's just the kind of deadly boring, but that's just how people think of the world when you've gone to read literature or history. But it's very effective as a storytelling tool when you're on the radio. And you think of a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist tells stories as well, but the stories he tells are the slices of a life. So he wants to tell a story of, did you hear voices, and what voices, what they're speaking, did you know who they were? Not interested necessarily on what they were saying, how that relates and connects to your mother. Not interested in whether it connects to your father or your cousins. So the storytellings are very different, and that is problematic. So when they are interviewing, when my colleague Horatio is interviewing one of our guests, he's doing a storytelling post-Freud. He's telling us, I say post-Freud because Dickens wouldn't have told a story like Freud. Dickens creates his characters, he puts them in a situation and they respond to that situation. He makes no assumptions that their character is due to the fact that their mother left them. Do you know what I mean? He just creates a character and he throws them into, in Tale of Two Cities, throws them into Paris during the Revolution and then sees how they behave in that setting. Whereas since Freud, people don't tell stories like that. They tell the stories to imply that somehow infancy and early childhood really matters to how you're going to respond to. That's okay, but it's a very monolithic way of thinking of a story. That's my view on it anyway. And that way of telling a story speaks much more to the audiences that are listening in contemporary life. And the psychiatrist's way of telling a story is static and very boring. But doesn't mean it's not true. Do you know what I mean? So I come back to the nature of truth. So to convince my colleagues, I talk all the time about truth. I say, it is true. What I mean is, they're hearing voices. So you're storytelling about where they were on the day. Yes, that's very interesting to the audience, but the audience too want to hear what the kind of voices they are. Do you know what I mean? So it occurs. It is a fact. And facts are important. They're not, I mean, some of them are boring, but they're still facts. So your point there is speaks to this idea there's a collision rather than a kind of, kind of merging, a kind of collision of traditions. And at present, there's a kind of supremacy in the artistic world of the humanities. And that can be problematic because when you listen to Radio 4 Today program, they get a scientist to come along and they think that they can interview that scientist without knowing anything at all about his subject, which they can't. But the same is true. The scientists, too, don't understand Shakespeare. They may have seen the plays, but they don't understand it. They don't realize that there are different ways of portraying a particular character and that there are people who know the different ways in which the character has been portrayed for the last 150 years. Do you know what I mean? And that's proper knowledge. Nothing to, it's not weaker knowledge, it's not less important knowledge, it's proper knowledge which the guys can tell you about, just like we can talk about serotonin and so on. Great, thank you.
So how do we sum this up? So Femi, you've got about 200 or so people here on a Sunday evening in the middle of summer when it's sunny outside. And I think that's a real testament to what a draw you are. And thank you so much for coming and giving the public lecture. I mean, your talk was absolutely fascinating, and I hope that many of you will now go and buy a copy of Ward number 6, and then we can...
With a commission to me.
And of course your poetry is also available online. I mean, the talk was fantastic, and of course your questions from everyone here and your responses to those were also a tour de force. I mean, you've talked about Chekhov being both a doctor and a writer, and so too are you. And let's hope you live a great deal longer than Chekhov did. You also talked about bringing things to the assessment of patients. You bring your charm and your wit and your intellect, and you've certainly brought all of those here this evening. So thank you for that. And you also talked about bringing the totality of yourself, not just a thin slice. And we certainly haven't been treated with only a thin slice. So I think get a real sense of the totality of you as a doctor and writer and conceptual thinker. And Femi, thank you so much for joining us and helping us in the BAP think about the importance of looking at insights from art and literature when we're thinking not only about clinical practice, but about all the other things that we do as well. So thank you very much, Femi. Thank you.
Thank you.